All right, ladies, your tumultuous few moments. I did my thesis on the underreporting of domestic violence, more specifically, intimate partner violence, as that captures romantic relations. So, to start, to start, we're going to go ahead and break down some vocabulary, just to make it clear for the rest of the presentation. Survivor is anyone who has survived or has been a victim of domestic violence abuse. We're not going to use the word abusee, we're not going to use the word victim, they are survivors. Abuser is someone who has committed acts of violence or acts of abuse towards a survivor. Intuition is the survivor's gut feelings. And then intimate partner violence is a type of domestic violence that transpires between two intimate partners and does not apply to children and or parents. So, starting with our literature review, what is domestic violence? What is intimate partner violence? Domestic violence is a felony or misdemeanor committed against an individual or either a current or former spouse, intimate partner, or co-parent. An offender may have also cohabitated with their victim as an intimate partner. The World Health Organization describes intimate partner violence as a major public health problem and a violation of women's rights. I think it doesn't go to shock anyone that this is one of the most underreported crimes across the nation. 1 in 3 women ages 18 and older experience intimate partner violence, or IPV, and 80% of IPV survivors were afraid to call police. 24% of survivors who did call police reported that they were unsure or would not report them again. That information, that data, came from RAIN, which is basically one of the biggest nonprofit that goes to protecting survivors against domestic violence. So historically, what do we have with EPV and domestic violence in the United States? It has only been within the past 20 to 25 years that this has been recognized as an actual crime, and there has been discussion about how we can prevent and take care of our survivors. In 1962, IPV cases were transferred from criminal court to family court. And it's important that you note that during this time, no criminal charges could be brought against the abuser. It was all settled civilly. During 1973, data shows that reported rape increased 60 to 62% across the country. And it's important to note that marital rape counts, because that was not yet recognized until the 70s. In 1975, most states allowed survivors to bring criminal charges against their husbands for abuse and injuries he caused her, including marital rape. And then in 1994, the Federal Violence Against Women Act lobbied and successfully brought forth the first laws and standard acknowledging intimate partner violence. That's less than 30 years ago. So, let's talk a little bit about intuition. Intuition is a natural ability or power that causes you to have feeling that you know something without ever experiencing it before. No proof of evidence, it's just a funny thing you feel in your gut. It's a buzzword. It's a buzzword for law enforcement, it's a buzzword for media. I did a quick Google search, tons of articles about listening to your gut, listening to your intuition pop up. But the funny thing is there's no medically sound reason or medically found source of where intuition actually comes from. It's just a generally accepted principle. So the closest we have is the enteric nervous system. And it is a complex system of neurons and neurotransmitters that live near the stomach. Neurons living in the stomach will send the information from your gut to your spinal cord and your brain, connecting the two nervous systems and sharing the information with targets. This was brought up in a data done by neuroscientists, and they said that while you can't physically remember every instance that happens to you, you can't physically recall it, your body does. So those situations where you get deja vu or you get that nasty gut feeling, that's your stomach remembering that you've been here before. So continuing on, there are a lot of implications that come with IPV, and there are a lot of implications that come with domestic violence as a whole. A big thing that a lot of survivors see is they see a big hit on physical and mental health. In fact, pre-Affordable Care Act, the funny thing is medical insurance companies could legally deny a domestic violence survivor from receiving appropriate coverage and help. They called it a pre-existing condition. So what that means, if you're not familiar, is let's say you have medical coverage and you get cancer and you try to get a better insurance company to help you take care of your chemo and pay for it. That insurance company could deny you that claim because it's too expensive and they're not causing it. Domestic violence shelters were told, or domestic violence survivors were told that their injuries were a pre-existing condition and coverage was either not available or incredibly expensive. It was only until the Affordable Care Act of 2012 to 2014 that the practice of denying or listing domestic violence as a pre-existing condition has been outlawed in all states across the nation, making it easier for survivors to get the help they need. So not only does it cause potential serious harm and cause access to need for hospitals, but it does some serious mental damage as well. The possible mental health and physical health aspects could be chronic pain, gastrointestinal and gynecological problems, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation and attempts, anxiety, substance abuse, and lowered self-esteem. So the current research is that we don't know a whole lot. Domestic violence is incredibly inaccurately reported, so professionals, especially the FBI and the Bureau of Justice, can only accurately predict that half of domestic violence are reported to law enforcement. They found that common reasons for not reporting abuse could be financial dependence on the abuser, family ties, family relations, social status, lack of options, and then learned helplessness. Something you guys I'm sure have heard of before, but if not, learned helplessness is a mental state in which an individual is forced to bear negative, painful stimuli that an individual eventually learns to accept, seeing as they have no other option. So, RAIN, the study we talked about earlier, Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network is the country's largest anti-sexual crime organization. They found that out of 1,000 abusers, 975 will walk free. They found that historically, of those 1,000 abusers, only 310 were reported to law enforcement by the survivors, 50 abusers were arrested, and 28 cases will be tried for felony conviction, and of that, 25 abusers will be sentenced to crime. The funny thing is, on a quick little tangent, in the state of Ohio, in order for you to file for a domestic violence claim, it's the first 2 misdemeanors. 2 misdemeanors that you have to report before you can receive any civil protection from the state. Unless, of course, in dramatic or serious situations. So looking at my study, I wanted to take all of those things. I wanted to take those survivors who have suffered at the hands of an intimate partner and the intuition that we've talked about and compare the two. So what I did is I had 6 empirical questions to address the severity, repetition, and survivors' intuition. Number 1 is, do survivors experience more severe abuse, also experience abuse more often? Do survivors have an instinct about the likelihood of domestic violence regarding their attacker? Do survivors' family or friends have a significant feeling or instinct toward their attacker? Does knowledge of resources available impact a survivor's likeliness to report? Do survivors currently report to law enforcement after their first instance? Or do survivors report to law enforcement after the abuse becomes more severe? So I did a main factor non-factorial between persons study with non-repeated measures designs. I had 3 independent variables. We looked at the first being severity of abuse. That's defined as the repetition and growth and intensity of abuse suffered at the hands of an abuser. The second is a survivor's likeliness to report. Are they likely to report the initial abuse, or are they likely to report the more continual abuse? And then third is intuition of survivor. It's that gut feeling. Did they feel that? Were they warned by family or friends? I had 50 surveys called the Underreporting of Domestic Violence. They were distributed with consent forms across the university and across 2 domestic violence shelters in North and Central Ohio. My dependent variables were types of abuse existed and resources available to survivors. My participants were 25 students from the university and 25 females living in domestic violence shelters. It's important that I tell you about 10 of my surveys, aside from those 50s, were thrown out. They were either incomplete, so meaning half of the questions weren't answered, or they were not the gender I was looking for. So my methodology. The important thing to acknowledge about domestic violence and IPV is it's incredibly sensitive and it's incredibly triggering. Anyone who has ever gone through that might not want to talk about it again. It's very important that when you're studying such an intense, gross, negligent crime, you take very intense care of your participants. So in doing that, I created a trigger warning at the top to say if they at all felt uncomfortable or if they all felt triggered, stop, shut it down. You don't have to answer. It's completely voluntary. So participants were given the exact same study. It was a 20-question survey that used a Likert scale to measure the dependent variables. I broke it up into 3 topics. Questions 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 9, and 10 focused on the severity of abuse that an individual experienced. Questions 4, 7, 8, 11, 12, and 14 focused on the likeliness of them to report. And then questions 13, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and 20 focused on the survivor's self-intuition. So, research questions. Does abuse become more severe for survivors? Are survivors more likely to report their abuse? And then do survivors experience abuse? Do they have intuition towards their attacker? My hypothesis were as follows, that there would be no significant difference between university students and those living in the shelter, that individuals who experienced more severe abuse had less of a negative intuition towards their survivors, and then please ignore my typo and listen to my words here. Individuals who experienced more severe abuse were less likely to report it. So looking here, this chart here are all of my 50 survivors. You can see here, not really much of a difference between individual students and domestic violence survivors living in the shelter. Preliminary findings found that my hypothesis number 1 was to be correct. There was no significant difference between participants who attended university and participants who were sheltered in domestic violence shelters. The important thing to realize there is that kind of sounds like a sentence when you think about it, because 1 in 10 experience it and even less report it. But the only thing you think about is, think about how many resources that Tiffin has. You walk over, and I'm not saying that the university is Tiffin, but walk over to the main building and go downstairs to the basement. Trust your gut. You've seen the posters, right? You know that they're down there. Report, call a friend, you're not alone. You would think that on a campus, whether it be Tiffin, whether it be Ohio State, whether it be Ohio Dominican, that there are more resources available to survivors, just not being realized. So, starting with the severity of abuse, it's important to realize that of all the questions, I graded them all on a Likert scale from 1 to 6 agree, disagree, strongly disagree, prefer not to answer. The highest score that someone could get, the more severe their abuse was that they experienced. That score was a 36. A t-test shows that the difference in means was a 25.3, non-student score of 26.8. Again, not statistically significant. There's no difference between survivors in shelters and survivors on college campuses. All right, walk away in a second. So if you look at it here in the graph, this doesn't really do it justice, but you can see here the T difference in the means, very minimal. The likeliness to report. The answer, the highest score to these were 30. The higher the score, the less likeliness to report their abuse. Median score for students was 16. Median score for survivors in shelters was 17.8. Data shows that there is no significant difference between students and non-students regardless of their likeliness to report. Again, that sounds very much like a duh statement, but if you think about the resources available in the campus community, you would think that might be a little bit easier. Likeliness to report, my graphs, again, not a very dramatic difference between the two. Intuition of survivors. This was my favorite part. This was the bread and butter. Did these survivors feel icky towards their partner? Did family, did friends, did anyone warn them or feel icky towards their partner? Highest score you could get was 36. The higher the score, the more intuition that the survivor felt towards their abuser. Students, 22.4. Survivors living in shelters, 23.4. Not significantly not statistically significant. Here's my graph. Looks a little dramatic because the numbers are a little bit different. Here's where it gets fun. So we looked at the two, and the original point of my data was supposed to be to compare non-students versus students, and that was it. But when I did the data and I put them all together, it looked like I was using the exact same group. Didn't have much of a sexy study. What I did is I compared the severity of abuse to the intuition, and I also compared the likeliness to report to the intuition as well to see if they relied on each other. Or intuition, more severe. Or intuition, more likely, less likely to report. These findings found that both my first and third variable and my first and second variable were also significant. They're highly correlated, which means, well, actually, that's a great question. That's a good opportunity for further study. We don't know why that is, but the more intuition you feel, more likely your abuse is going to be more severe. So the discussion was to introduce engaged survivors' intuition. This was the whole point. It's something that's very highly talked about. It's something that's very popularized. But because there's no scientific data on where intuition comes from, why are we using it and highlighting it if we don't know what it means and we can't back up the data? If you look for data on intuition, the majority of the articles you're going to find are on doctors treating their patients. That's it. To my knowledge and to my research, didn't find a whole lot about intuition in the face of law enforcement. Opportunity for further study. So furthermore, the study added that additional layer. Data found that statistically, there was no difference between survivors of domestic violence in college and those currently residing in domestic violence shelters. The National Violence Hotline showed that women who called the police and reported their abuse wish that they had not called. 1 in 4 women in the study reported that they would not call the police in the future, and more than half said that calling the police made things worse. If you think about the likeliness to report, that makes sense. Questions 7 and 8 were direct questions about the survivor involving law enforcement. If you think back to those studies, 1 in 4 would not call again. We can see here that that's actually correct. In my study, out of 50 women, only 3 survivors reported their abuse after their attack. It's 6%. And only 4 survivors, 8%, said that they continuously called the police after reaching that. So, limitations. The Likert scale didn't really allow anyone to express upon their situation, their justification of whether or not they did involve the police. That was done for allowing survivors to answer in a quick, concise, less triggering manner. Another thing is individuals did not distinguish whether they were a student or a survivor currently residing within the domestic violence shelters. So the only reason that I knew that is because I got mail-in packets from the shelters. If I would have handed them out and got them all at the same time, wouldn't have known which is which. And then social, economic, and financial status were not accounted for each of the survivors. That's really interesting because a lot of times if you look into domestic violence shelters or domestic violence research, a lot of the survivors that you'll see tend to be on the lower socioeconomic side. So if you introduce that study, it'd be very interesting to see the difference in the classes. For future research opportunities should be conducted to further expand upon the previous limitations. These also should be done to reach out to men, because like it or not, men are abusers, but so are females, and we believe in equality. In future research, I recommend expanding upon each of these using their own survey, so having 3 different surveys instead of the 1. That was an intentional choice and limitation on my end. If I could go back, I would do it a different way. But I wanted all of my survivors to be quick, dirty, get it done. I didn't want them sitting there ruminating on their attacks. With that being said, last questions. Anyone? You can say that. It's okay.
No, can you go back to the correlation slide?
Yeah. So there's a typo. That should be 2 and 3.
So we found no statistically significant difference when you define, so he stops.
Oh, so that they're highly.
Outliers. What are those outliers?
The outliers, these are people that reported having more severe abuse but less intuition. And then over here, this one is they reported but also felt no intuition.
They did feel more intuition.
No, less.
They did not. Okay.
It's less. So if you look at between the two, they're all connected, but the social statistically between the students and survivors.
So essentially you found there's no intuition.
Yeah.
What is SI? What's the significance level for these two tests?
What was that?
Yeah, because you say they are significant. I don't see their significance number. So what's the p-value there?
Oh, so the p-value on these I don't have on the slides, which is a mistake on my end. I would have to include that. When I broke down the social significance and found that they weren't statistically significant, that was between the students and the shelter residents. This looks at the group as a whole.
So is this number is the highest is significant correlation between two?
Yes.
Because the number not really high. So I wonder the significant level. Are they significant?
I'm wrong. It's not statistically significant.
She's thinking you're saying it is.
Oh, it is not.
It's not? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, that was my mistake.
Okay. And then I have a question about your design. Can you go back to that? You say one by one, the slide?
No, so it's not a one by one. It's a main factor comparison.
Okay.
But when I put everything together, I wanted everyone to be able to see what I was, hold on, we'll get there eventually. What I was and was not using.
Okay. So
That's also a typo. Lots of typos.
So this is not one by one. Your design is not one by one, right?
No, it's not one by one. It's a main factor, non-factorial.
Okay.
So that was just a mistake.
Okay. Just clarification. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No.
It did not. It
No.
looks like it's a 2x2, but it's not.
It's not. That was to make it visual. I just think it hurt more than it helped.
Yes.
Is there any reason you chose to do like half of the university students and half of the shelter? Yeah. Is there a reason?
So we have access to university students and we have access to that research, but I wanted to tap into women who have lived this and perhaps weren't a regularly considered population.
Do you think that would have affected your data though? Because they're all 25 of those, they all experienced it rather than some, not all of the university students have. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that if I had done all 50 university students, that definitely would have impacted it. I think the results would have been the same, that there was no difference between them, but just something that I chose not to do.
I have another question. Oh, did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. So on the intuition thing, I think, I didn't look at the questionnaire, but I think I remember your questionnaire. You had something like their family members saying, did any of those come up statistically, or did you not measure that?
I didn't mention that. No, I did the question as a whole.
That's interesting to me. Like, you have family members who are I never liked it, you went, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is all speculation, this has not been researched at all, but I have the feeling that a lot of survivors who are currently in shelters have less or maybe not close access to their family, their support. Whether that be distance, that family lives far away, or lack of ability to them, I just have a feeling that the family measure wouldn't be quite as strong.
Yeah. Fang-Mei, do you have any questions?
No, I think I'm good. Just that two part for the clarification. But overall, you did a very good job, Tristyn.
Definitely had some typos, we'll fix that.
Yeah, I told them that they have to just turn it into the Moodle, all the PowerPoint, the paper, and the RSH. And get all that done, it's done. Congratulations.
Thanks, guys.
Good, very good.